Welcome back to Disney Unpacked. It's me, Len Testa, and well, with today's installment for this video series for Patreon, we're going to do something different. Previously, when I've been joined on the show by veteran Imagineer Jim Scholl.
I like different. Hey guys, how's it going?
And entertainment writer Jim Hill.
Hey there.
We've talked about something that got built at a Disney theme park, the challenges that particular project faced as it went through Imagineering's development process. But all of our Disney Unpacked shows to date have basically ended the same way, with the three of us talking about how that ride or attraction eventually opened to the public. That ends today.
And that doesn't sound ominous at all.
Well, that's because on this month's Disney Unpacked, I want us to talk about EPCOT's Equatorial Africa Pavilion. I've been obsessed with this proposed World Showcase Pavilion for years now. And by that, I mean I've read the diplomatic cables where Henry Kissinger was using his sources inside the State Department way back in the 1970s to help arrange introductions for Disney executives with leaders of various African countries. And then as the company tried to find a country on the continent who'd then be willing to shoulder the costs of building the pavilion.
Okay, I think you're getting way ahead of our story here, Len. So not to reveal too much too soon, but securing the funding for this particular pavilion, yeah, it was a challenge, but it wasn't a challenge for the reasons you might commonly think.
I've also been in the Buddy Baker archives at New York University and held in my hands the sheets of music that Buddy Baker wrote for the Heartbeat of Africa film. And that was supposed to be the film-based attraction for EPCOT's Equatorial Africa Pavilion.
And what's interesting about that one is that that film was completed and hundreds of Walt Disney Studios employees actually got to see it and listen to the score that Buddy Baker wrote for the Heartbeat of Africa in a temporary theater that got set up inside of one of the sound stages in the Burbank lot back in the summer of 1982.
And more recently, I've reached out to the University of Tennessee, which is where Alex Haley's personal papers wound up after the author of Roots passed away back in February of 1992. And that's how I got hold of the script and storyboards for Africa Rediscovered, which is the 15-minute long film that...
Well, let me interrupt for a moment, because Africa Rediscovered, it was going to be the big marquee attraction for this new pavilion there on World Showcase. This was going to be an epic film hosted by star power himself, which was Alex Haley, who at that point was a really big deal, now under contract to the Walt Disney Company, to shine a spotlight on 10,000 years of African history.
Right. And Alex Haley made an appearance on that TV special, which CBS aired for EPCOT's grand opening back in October of 1982. Jim Hill, what was that called?
Epcot Center, the opening celebration?
Okay, I get it, Len, but it was during that TV special that Alex Haley famously turned to that show's host, who was Mr. Danny Kaye. And he said, okay, this is great. We'll be back in a year to celebrate the opening of this brand new pavilion. Exactly.
Which means EPCOT's Equatorial Africa Pavilion was scheduled to open sometime in what, 1983, 1984?
Yeah, that was the plan. I mean, you got to remember this. Once they announced that it was going to open, the marketing team for Walt Disney World had gone into high gear.
So what happened?
Oh, so many things happened in that era, Len. Where do we start? Well, let's start here. When Epcot Center opened, it kicked off a really rough, problematic 2-year stretch for the Walt Disney Productions headquartered there in Burbank, California. And it took about 2 years for all the dust to settle. But when the dust settled in the fall of 1984, Mr. Michael Eisner had now been installed as a new head of the Disney Company. He had a very clear and different vision from what had happened before he arrived. And he had an idea about what Epcot needed that, it was going to go in a different direction.
And I get that, right? New players, new game. But here's the thing. We know that the World Showcase Pavilion for Equatorial Africa was way along in its development process. We know that Ken Anderson was the designer, Harper Goff and Herbie Ryman were on it, right? And these are people that Walt himself had brought over from Disney Studios back in the 50s to help originally design Disneyland, right?
Yeah, and also worth noting here was the Tishman family collection of African art, which, by the way, the Walt Disney Productions bought and paid for in 1984, 2 years after Epcot Center first opened, with the plan that this collection was then going to be put on display in the Africa Museum, which was another attraction that the Imagineers had planned for the Equatorial Africa Pavilion.
Right. So, I mean, all the pieces were there. We had the A team in terms of Imagineering and design, right? The company had already spent all this money to get Alex Haley, again, A-list talent, to write the script. I mean, heck, the souvenir map that was sold in the park in the early 80s, it flat out said Equatorial Africa Pavilion coming next, future pavilion at Epcot, right? So again, what happened?
Well, it's not a plot to sell a lot of maps for things that would never happen. We'll settle that over here. That's not the reason. There was a different reason, though, and actually a set of reasons. So one of them is when the World Showcase Pavilion slid from being an opening day attraction at Epcot to something that would then debut later on in, well, what they were calling Epcot Phase 2, Equatorial Africa at that moment became not a sure bet, but a project at risk. In fact, some questioned that Africa as a concept, in fact, wasn't strong enough as an idea that would drive intent to visit.
All right, Jim Scholl, you've got to fill in our listeners here. What is intent to visit?
Well, it's one of those, vague little secret terms that Disney loves to throw around, but basically it boils down to the intent to visit is a measurement that defines a ride, show, and attraction that is strong enough, big enough, great enough that it will compel people to visit. So if a family's sitting in Dallas, they find out, oh, there's something new to see in Disney World, so let's go.
Okay, so an attraction by itself that will make people come if it's new. We could have an entire series on just by going through the list of attractions in each park and determining whether it has an intent to visit. But okay, let's say that Epcot's Equatorial Africa didn't have a ride or a show like that, something that would power an intent to visit. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, and what you just touched on before was a real important point, because something that gets into the open day menu maybe isn't that strong, but as part of a whole park that's opening all at once, it'll slide through. But this wasn't that. This was going to be Phase 2. And that Africa Pavilion, it didn't have a big ride. It didn't have big entertainment. It didn't have much of anything in its favor other than the fact that people had worked on it for years in Glendale, and that pavilion was ready to build. Now, if Michael Eisner had walked in the door, looked at everything he saw, and said, guys, I love this, go build it. And I believe you that on that Monday, construction cranes would have been, plowing the earth there in Epcot. But, it didn't happen that way because Michael didn't say go. What he said instead was, I want to think about something else. I think what we really need, I have a hankering for some cold fish and a ride down the fjord. So let's go build the Norway Pavilion. That's what happened next.
Okay, and that was because Norway had a ride, a thrill ride to be specific, Maelstrom?
Well, we knew it as sea venture. It sounds like something you do at a clothing store. But anyway, Maelstrom was the name, and it was going to be a thrill ride-ish, a mild thrill ride. It did count, though, as a ride, which, World Showcase, as we know, was film, 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 restaurant, film, film. You get the point. Anyway, all they had really was a lot of films, and so World Showcase getting a ride in Norway would count on the plus side for that park. Now, it wasn't a thrill ride, but it was a lot better as a ride than Mexico.
It still kind of breaks my heart because when you look at the concept art for the Africa Pavilion, not to mention all the shots of the model, that could have been really spectacular in a lot of ways.
Yeah, spectacular in a lot of ways, but and a lot of people would agree with you, Len. In fact, they do, because they agreed to so much that chunks of that never built World Showcase Pavilion did filter out into the other Disney parks there in Florida. In fact, the studios in Animal Kingdom are great showcases to go and see some of the thoughts that drove Equatorial Africa's creative development.
Okay. So, well, all right. Well, why don't we do that with today's show? Why don't we take all of the research that Len's done to date about the Equatorial Africa Pavilion and talk about what might have been if they actually built this thing?
And cutting to the chase, more to the point, why this particular addition to World Showcase there at EPCOT never got built, never made it off the drawing board.
All right. I am both up and down with this idea. So cue the title sequence, Eric. Okay, let's start with the obvious. I mean, I get why, if you're designing a world showcase for Walt Disney World, you want an Africa Pavilion. It is, after all, the largest continent on the planet.
But more to the point, when you look at World Showcase, at least the one that Epcot Center first opened with, how does Sam the Eagle describe the finale of Muppet Vision 3D?
Oh, he says, it's a salute to all nations, but mostly America.
And in that same vein, when I look at World Showcase, even today, what I see is a salute to all nations, but mostly the European Union.
Okay.
This is really true. They wanted World Showcase to have some pavilions that weren't European, which is another reason that Disney met with the leaders of multiple African nations back in the mid-1970s.
And from what you've shared previously about all those diplomatic cables that you read, Len, or the WikiLeaks stuff, Disney had no trouble getting an initial meeting with these folks. Where the problem started was, well, when it came time to close the deal.
Yeah, closing a deal and cutting the check are always a problem in my life, too. But when the time came to close that deal, it meant that the costs, well, it was an unusual predicament they found themselves in, because all the other pavilions there along World Showcase Lagoon represented one single country, which meant one single country paid the freight charge to build any one of the pavilions. But in the case of Equatorial Africa, the problem is right there in the name. It wasn't a country that they were representing, it was the entire continent. And so as a result, they had to, and they being Disney Legal, Disney Marketing, Disney Group, they had to go and solicit a lot of different countries there on the continent to give them their piece of the check that they would have to be paying.
Right. And that said, I mean, based on the documents that we've read about the construction of EPCOT, wasn't the plan like super early on that the host countries would pay something like 2/3 of the cost of building their pavilions, and then Disney would pick up the rest of the cost?
Yeah, we've been looking at the same documents, but they all tell us that basically the countries that were being represented would pay 2/3 of the development and construction costs for their pavilion. I mean, one note though, that was early on, and things could change, and did.
Right, I imagine they would. But as you read through these diplomatic cables, you can see that the leaders of these African countries and their various ministers, they're delighted that Disney's reaching out to them and inviting them to take part in EPCOT. But when it came time to the nuts and bolts, the brass tacks of the actual cost of building the EPCOT pavilion. Right?
Well, no, not to interrupt, but what was the average cost of building an opening day World Showcase pavilion?
Well, what we know, Jim, is that the average cost of opening a World Showcase pavilion was $100 million. Now, I'll say $100 million back then. So if you accelerate that into 2024 dollars, it's
$64 quintillion. No,
yeah, bazillion.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the thing, right? Given that many of the African nations that Disney met with back then had populations that were mostly agrarian, at the time, farming, asking those countries' government officials to make a huge financial commitment, tens of millions of dollars for a pavilion that would be built half a world away at a theme park in Florida, that was, to be polite, a non-starter for a lot of them, right?
said, though, didn't South Africa repeatedly, volunteer to underwrite the cost of building an African-themed World Showcase Pavilion?
This, guys, is where the sensitivity training that we all undertook at the end of season 1 is really going to come in handy. So let's proceed with this conversation. Go ahead.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's first off put again a caveat. 40 years ago was a very different world than the world we enjoy today. So yes, we know that South Africa was very, very eager to underwrite the entire cost of building an African-themed World Showcase Pavilion. They're in Florida. But the last time I looked around, that didn't happen. So, the Disney company, they said, thank you very much. And they started looking elsewhere for other funding sources for their Equatorial Africa Pavilion.
Sorry, Jim, I've got to say this. Reading the memo that Disney wrote that explains why they can't choose South Africa is a model document in diplomatic speak. It's like, they're not really representative of the rest of the continent. It's a great way of saying y'all have some serious problems and we're not going to touch you with a 10-foot pole. But it was really well written memo. Yeah,
it truly was. It was a diplomatic triumph. But while we're talking about that, you got to understand that the Imagineers there in Glendale, California, hadn't been told to stop. In fact, they've been told, keep going. Let's keep working on this because this is a sure thing. Danny Kaye told us so, right there on network television. It's a sure thing. And so they started working and continuing working on it. And they had some problems to solve. For example, one of the things about Disney, they had represented for a very long time that continent. I mean, you could mosey on over to the Magic Kingdom and climb aboard one of the river boats there in the Adventureland Jungle Cruise and see Africa for yourself. That's what they were dealing with.
Yeah, but that's the Hollywood-inspired, version of Africa, which I get, as I understand it, that was the whole point of the Heartbeat of Africa movie, which was supposed to use music as a way to show a more authentic picture of what modern day Africa was like. Well, modern day Africa circa the early 1980s, I mean.
And that movie was shot on location in Africa, right? And after it was edited and scored, Heartbeat of Africa was shown to Disney employees in Burbank back in the summer of '82. So this thing actually exists.
Yeah, it was a temp track, and there was some rough edits, but it wasn't color corrected. But the people who were, shall we say, volunteered, and I know because I was one of those people who were volunteered, quote, air quotes, to go and sit in a very hot town stage in order to look at the movie, usually several times because the producer, the show director, the creative director were taking notes. And we served the role of being a test audience.
Two things. A, you've actually seen this movie?
I have. Okay.
And then two, the completed Heartbeat of Africa film is somewhere in a Disney vault. Is that what we're saying?
Well, yeah, it's in a vault in a salt mine down at the bottom of the ocean. Yes, all the above is true.
The way the universe works, Lens, it's probably on the same shelf next to Song of the South. And it just
the universe is ironic like that. Exactly. Yeah.
There we go.
So never mind that. Okay. All right. So let me just say, if Disney was smart, they would dig that film out of the vault and then make it available for viewing on Disney Plus. Because I guarantee you that tens of millions of people would watch that film.
Oh, yeah.
Well, my annual renewal period is coming up on Disney Plus, so that would probably get me to send them my check for the next 12 months. So, yeah, I'm down with that. But, there's also other films that were also completed for this pavilion that never was built. There's also another film, and this one's called The Watering Hole.
Okay, I'm just going to put it out here right now. That would be a really great name for a place where, as you're walking around World Showcase Lagoon, you could stop and get an African-themed adult beverage.
Okay. Okay. So,
but ironically enough, there were no beverages to be found in this version of The Watering Hole. But there was, however, something special, something called a film loop.
Okay, now a film loop rather than a really for real movie with a beginning, middle, and an end.
And honestly, it's a little hard to describe. It was more of an experience than it was a story. And the way it would work is when you look at the old model photos that we have of Equatorial Africa, there's a giant tree and a tree house on top of that tree. And so guests would be traveling up through the tree, through the roots and caves, and up to the tree house that was built up in the highest, tallest branches of this very tall, very fake tree. And effectively, this tree was going to be the front door to the Equatorial Africa Pavilion.
There are so many ways you could branch out this conversation, and that's a joke.
Wow. Okay.
But I mean, so Jim Scholl, you climb up in the tree to the treehouse. What were you supposed to see then?
Well, you're going to, if you're in good health, you can climb up to the top of this very tall tree, and you'd have a beautiful overlook of all of World Showcase Lagoon. But the other thing you do is then you turn the corner and go into a very dimly lit space. And after your eyes had adjusted down to the darkness, you'd find yourself looking out over a watering hole on an African savanna at the golden hour, twilight. And as you stood there, you'd hear and see lions, elephants, giraffes, and zebras. And they'd step out of the shadows to go to the watering hole to drink from the water.
You know, if Bob Chapek were CEO and he'd ever seen this, we would have fireworks viewing parties in the Africa Pavilion by now. It would already exist. It's one thing for a restaurant that was originally proposed for the Trio Life to get cut. It's something completely different to have an entire EPCOT Pavilion not get built at EPCOT. And I got to say, the theme park kind of suffers a little bit because of it, even today, because it never got built. There is a gaping spot where we all know it should have gone.
It is. There is a gaping spot. And, you and Jim and I have walked by the gaping spot where there's, a couple of palm trees and a little building. And it underperforms in its aspiration, shall we say. But, the reality is, even if that had been built, we would now be talking about a pavilion that would be over 4 decades old. And given the way that the company works, had Mr. Chapek still been in that seat today, it'd probably look very, very different than the EPCOT Equatorial Africa Pavilion that had been designed and being planned to be built.
That's probably true.
Okay, so now time to bring this month's installment to a close. So... And all right, so Mr. Scholl, what are we working on for next month now?
Oh, Jim Hill, we've got actually 2 things in the work right now. One is we're going to actually take the Africa Rediscovered script and we're going to complete the storyboard. We're going to do a whole treatment as if the movie had been made. We're also going to be talking about similar shows to Heartbeat of Africa, things that were well along in the development that never got opened. And if that's not enough on our plate, we're also going to be talking about another idea, which is something that is snake bit. And by that, I'm speaking of the Alien Encounter show, which became the Stitch Escape show, which is going to be, last time we were there was seating for an ice cream parlor. So which show comes first? You'll be as surprised as we are, but it'll be one of those.
Did you guys see that there's going to be an off-Broadway production of Extraterrestrial Alien Encounter?
All right, I got to see that Broadway show. But before those 2 episodes of Disney Unpacked drop, if you folks have any questions that relate to the topics that Mr. Testa, Mr. Scholl, and I have touched on in today's show, well, feel free to send those along to contact@DisneyUnpacked.com, and we'll then answer those queries as part of a new episode of Disney Unpacked Q&A.
And beyond that, we're produced spectacularly by Eric Hersey. Until next month's show, this is Len Testa on behalf of Jim Scholl and Jim Hill, and we thank you guys for watching this episode of Disney Unpacked.